The last thing Laura Burns remembered as they led her out of her house was Marie's eyes, a calm, steady gaze that carried the weight of the town's unspoken law. All this time, it had never been the judge. It had always been Marie. And in that instant, Laura finally understood how deep the roots of the town's darkness ran. Laura Burns returned to Willow Creek with a sense of longing, hoping to rekindle the gentle warmth she remembered from her childhood. The years she had spent teaching in the city had been fulfilling, but as retirement loomed, she found herself craving the simplicity of her small hometown, where summer evenings still smelled of honeysuckle and neighbors knew each other by name. She arrived expecting a sense of belonging, a comforting welcome, but what she found instead was a stifling silence that settled over the town like a heavy fog. Her old friends greeted her warmly at first, Marie Ashford among them. The two women embraced in Marie's living room, the air filled with awkward laughs and hesitant memories of games played in backyards and secrets shared under the shade of the old oak tree. Yet something in Marie's demeanor seemed different. Her laughter was muted, her smile strained. Laura could see the hesitation in her eyes, something guarded, almost fearful. She noticed it in others too, old acquaintances who would drop their voices when certain names were mentioned, or avert their eyes when Laura asked about the people missing from her memory. She remembered Johnny Wilkes, the troublemaker from her childhood, always daring the rest of them to sneak into the woods after dark. She remembered how one summer Johnny had disappeared, and how her mother had told her he had simply run away. But here, in Willow Creek, Laura could feel that same story hanging in the air, carefully rehearsed, repeated for decades. The first real sign of trouble came during a town hall meeting. Judge Harold Griggs presided, his booming voice echoing through the dusty room. Laura watched as he spoke with authority, his eyes scanning the gathered crowd as if daring anyone to oppose him. He was in his 70s now, but still exuded an aura of control that made Laura's skin prickle. She found herself wondering just how much of the town's fearful compliance was because of him. After the meeting, she lingered by the doorway, hoping to talk to Marie. Instead, she overheard two men, their voices low and cautious. "Shouldn't have come back, that's all I'm saying," one muttered. "People don't leave Willow Creek and just come back asking questions. She's poking at things best, left alone." Laura knew deep down they were talking about her. The following days felt like a strange, twisted echo of the life she once knew. Marie came by with casseroles and stories about her children, but there was an emptiness behind her words, a sense of duty rather than friendship. Laura had once thought of Marie as timid, the type to follow rather than lead, but now the sharpness in Marie's eyes betrayed something else entirely, an awareness, a watchfulness that kept Laura on edge. It wasn't until she began to ask about Johnny Wilkes that things truly started to unravel. The more Laura probed, the more the friendly smiles turned cold. Doors that had once been open now closed as she approached. She found herself followed, not overtly, but in a way that let her know her movements were being tracked. And always, there was Marie, appearing at her doorstep with a smile, telling her she needed to let the past rest. "Some things are just best forgotten, Laura," Marie said one evening, her voice soft but her tone unyielding. "Johnny left. It's as simple as that." But Laura could hear the unspoken threat beneath the words. Determined, Laura began to piece together what she could. She sought out old records, spoke to people at the outskirts of town who were less fearful of the judge's reach. What she found pointed back to Judge Griggs, or so she thought. His name appeared in places it shouldn't, linked to disappearances that had never been solved. It all seemed to lead back to him, the stern patriarch holding Willow Creek in his iron grip. But then Laura stumbled upon a photograph, an old, faded picture of the town fair, taken the summer Johnny disappeared. There was Marie, her eyes focused on Johnny, her hand resting on his shoulder. There was something in her eyes, something Laura had never noticed before. And suddenly it clicked. Marie had always been there. Behind every rumor, every whispered story, every silencing glance, it was Marie. Laura confronted her that night, her voice trembling but resolute. "It was never him, was it? It was you. All these years, it was you keeping everyone in line." Marie's expression didn't change. She sighed, almost sadly, before stepping closer. "You should have let it go, Laura. You don't understand what it takes to keep people safe, to keep the town from falling apart." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were ice. And as the figures stepped into Laura's house, their faces obscured by shadows, she realized the truth. The judge had been a figurehead, a convenient symbol to point to when people needed someone to blame. It had always been Marie, quiet, compliant Marie, who pulled the strings, who whispered in the ears of the judge and the sheriff and the townspeople alike. As they led her away, Laura looked back at her oldest friend, hoping for a sign of regret, some hint of the girl she once knew. But all she saw was Marie's steady gaze, the cold, unflinching eyes of someone who believed in what she was doing, someone who had convinced herself that she was saving Willow Creek by controlling it. Laura knew then that she wouldn't be the last, that as long as Marie was there, the town's secrets would remain buried, and anyone who tried to unearth them would vanish into the silence. Story 2. Daniel Mercer hadn't thought he'd return to his hometown of Riverview, not after all these years. Yet, when news reached him about the Community Project, a new initiative by the town council that promised to revive the local economy, he was curious enough to take a break from his work as an investigative journalist to see what it was all about. Riverview had always been a quiet, quaint town, and the thought of a bustling economic renewal seemed almost too good to be true. His old haunts were still there, the diner with the best coffee and worst service, the river that ran its lazy course along the outskirts of town, and the hardware store owned by Benjamin Lewis. Daniel had never paid much attention to Benjamin back in the day. He was just the quiet guy in the background. A familiar face, yes, but one Daniel never gave much thought to. The community project seemed harmless enough at first. The mayor, Evelyn Carter, stood on the platform in front of Town Hall, her voice filled with optimism as she talked about new jobs, new businesses, and a new sense of purpose for Riverview. The people seemed to rally behind her, their applause echoing through the square. And yet, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. It was the way Evelyn's eyes never quite met the crowd, like she was putting on a show, hiding something behind her polished smile. As he started asking questions, Daniel found his old classmates and acquaintances a little too welcoming at first. They spoke about the project in glowing terms, their eyes glistening with something almost rehearsed. It wasn't until Daniel began digging deeper that the walls started to go up. He asked about the funding, about the strange accidents that seemed to happen whenever someone opposed the project. An unexplained fire at the local grocer's, a sudden accident that left the town's only journalist in a coma. People began avoiding his questions, their smiles turning tight, their voices lowering to mutterings whenever he walked by. He turned his attention to Evelyn. She seemed to be the linchpin, the one leading this sudden change. Daniel watched her as she made speeches, attended meetings, and mingled with the townspeople, always with the same practiced warmth. But something didn't add up. He learned of private meetings held at night, gatherings of local business owners that Evelyn always attended, and the way those who didn't attend somehow fell out of favor. One evening, after another of Evelyn's overly cheerful speeches, Daniel caught sight of Benjamin Lewis standing at the edge of the crowd. He was clapping, but his eyes were on Evelyn, sharp and calculating, not filled with admiration like the rest of the audience. There was something about the way Benjamin watched her, something that made Daniel pause. Benjamin had always been quiet, but now Daniel saw it. He wasn't just observing, he was controlling. Daniel's investigations led him to a series of old property records. Names were crossed out, properties transferred quietly. Benjamin's name appeared again and again, often taking over ownership from families who had supposedly left town. There were whispers, people talking about how those who disagreed with the community project were encouraged to move on, and the whispers all led back to Benjamin. One night, Daniel decided to confront Benjamin. He walked into the hardware store, pretending to browse until the last customer left. Benjamin was behind the counter, his face impassive as Daniel approached. "I know what you've been doing, Benjamin. Daniel said, his voice low but steady. Benjamin looked up at him, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Do you now?" Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had expected denial, anger, perhaps even fear. But Benjamin was calm, too calm. "The accidents, the disappearances, it all points back to you," Daniel continued, his voice faltering as Benjamin stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on an old rag. "You think Evelyn's in charge?" Benjamin asked, his tone almost amused. "She's just a face for the project, someone the town could rally behind, but the real work, the real decisions, have always been mine." He moved closer, his eyes cold. "People need direction, Daniel. They need someone to keep things running smoothly, someone to make the hard decisions." He paused, his gaze locking onto Daniel's. "You should have stayed in the city." Daniel turned to leave, his heart pounding, but Benjamin's grip was already on his shoulder, firm and unyielding. "You can't just walk away now. You've seen too much." The next thing Daniel knew, he was being led out the back of the store, Benjamin's voice in his ear, calm and deliberate. "You want to write your story, Daniel? Well, let me tell you the ending. No one leaves Riverview. Not anymore." The next day, Riverview was quiet again. The community project continued, the townspeople smiling and nodding as Evelyn made her rounds, talking about the bright future ahead. And Benjamin? He was back at the hardware store, his eyes scanning the street, always watching, always waiting for the next person who might need a little convincing. And Daniel? He was gone. No one asked where. No one dared. Because in Riverview, everyone knew. You didn't question the community project. You didn't question Benjamin Lewis. Not if you wanted to stay. Story 3. Andrew Price had always thought his father's work at the cemetery was lonely, but honest. It was only after his father's funeral that he learned just how deep the roots of the town's secrets ran, hidden beneath the graves he now tended. When Andrew Price moved back to Grayson Hollow after his father's passing, he thought he was coming home to a life of quiet reflection, a chance to grieve, and a way to keep his family's modest tradition alive by taking on the role of cemetery caretaker. He had always found the cemetery peaceful as a child, its rows of tombstones a reminder of the passage of time, of the people who had shaped the community before him. It was hard at 28 to trade in his bustling life in the city for a secluded one among the dead, but grief had a way of changing priorities. For the first few weeks, life in Grayson Hollow was predictable. The air smelled of damp leaves. The creaky cemetery gate groaned every morning as Andrew opened it, and he soon found comfort in the routines his father had left behind. But it didn't take long before Andrew began to notice strange patterns. Each funeral seemed to leave behind more than just grief. Each one was followed by another disappearance, an unrelated resident quietly vanishing from the town's landscape. It wasn't something anyone else seemed to be talking about, and maybe that was the strangest part of all. The first incident Andrew noticed was during the funeral for old Mr. Thompson. A simple ceremony, with Pastor Joel Harris presiding over the service, his voice filled with warmth and sympathy. Pastor Joel had always been well-liked. He had a way of comforting people, making them believe that everything would be all right. But then, a week later, Mrs. Clara from the bakery stopped showing up for work. Andrew overheard whispers at the local diner. "Maybe she finally left for that trip she always talked about," someone suggested, but their voice lacked conviction. Andrew's suspicion grew with each new funeral, a young man's tragic death in a car accident, followed by the sudden disappearance of the school janitor, a beloved teacher passing away quietly in her sleep, followed days later by her neighbor vanishing without a word. The more Andrew observed, the more he felt there was a connection. And the one person who seemed to be at every funeral, who seemed to always know just the right thing to say, was Pastor Joel. The pastor's presence, once comforting, now seemed almost sinister. His eyes lingering on the mourners, his prayers whispered just a little too softly. Andrew began watching Pastor Joel, noting his movements, the way he seemed to appear at the cemetery even when there wasn't a service. He followed him one night, keeping his distance as the pastor walked the quiet streets, only to find himself led back to the church, where Joel knelt in solitary prayer, the candlelight flickering around him. There was nothing sinister about his actions, nothing to suggest he was involved in anything more than grieving for his flock. Frustrated, Andrew turned his attention elsewhere. He spent long nights in the cemetery's small office, poring over old ledgers and records that his father had kept. It was there, among the faded ink and yellowed pages, that he found something unusual, a logbook, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was old, older than anything his father could have kept. The names written inside were familiar, but it wasn't just a list of those buried in the cemetery. It was something more, a ledger of deaths and disappearances, written in a careful looping script. And at the bottom of each page was a symbol, a mark Andrew didn't recognize. He took the logbook to Sarah Jennings, the town's elderly librarian. Sarah had always been kind to him, offering him tea whenever he visited the library as a child and helping him with his school projects. She was one of the few people Andrew felt he could trust. Sarah examined the logbook, her brow furrowing as she traced the symbol with her finger. "This," she said quietly, "is a very old mark. Older than the town itself, perhaps." Andrew thought nothing of it when Sarah offered to help him research the symbol. She seemed eager, almost too eager, but Andrew was desperate for answers. He spent days waiting, continuing his work at the cemetery, watching as another funeral came and went, and with it, another disappearance. When he finally returned to the library, Sarah greeted him with the same warm smile, but something in her eyes had changed, a sharpness, a watchfulness that set Andrew on edge. "I've found what you're looking for," she said, leading him to a back room in the library. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. Sarah placed the logbook on the table between them, her hand resting on it as she looked at him. "You should have let this go, Andrew," she whispered. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Andrew's heart pounded as Sarah began to explain. The logbook was a record, a ledger of the town's balance. For every death, there had to be another, a trade to keep the town in balance, as she put it. It had always been this way, long before Andrew's father had taken over as caretaker. The disappearances weren't random. They were chosen, carefully orchestrated to maintain a dark equilibrium that kept Grayson Hollow safe from something far worse. And Sarah? She had been the one keeping it all in order, ensuring that the ledger was never left unbalanced. "The pastor doesn't know," Sarah said, her voice almost tender. "He thinks he's helping people pass on, comforting them. But this," she tapped the logbook, "this is the real work. The work that keeps us all safe." Her eyes met Andrew's, and he saw no remorse there, only determination. "Your father understood. He did what needed to be done. You need to understand that too." Andrew backed away, his eyes darting to the door, but Sarah's frail hand was suddenly a vice on his arm. "If you try to fight this, you'll disappear too," she said, her voice cold, "and no one will ask where you've gone." Andrew knew then that he had a choice, to continue his father's work, to become a part of the town's twisted legacy, or to fight and risk everything. As Sarah released him, he stumbled out of the library, the weight of the logbook still heavy in his hands. The town around him seemed unchanged, the people going about their lives as if nothing was wrong, as if they weren't all living under the shadow of the cemetery's dark secret. And as Andrew stood at the cemetery gate that evening, looking out over the rows of tombstones, he realized that the peace he had once found here had been a lie. The cemetery wasn't just a resting place for the dead, it was the heart of something much darker, something that demanded a price. And Andrew, whether he liked it or not, was now a part of it. Story 4. The quiet desperation of a mother can lead to unthinkable actions, and in Havenbrook, one woman's silent battle has thrown an entire town into turmoil. Ellie Davis had always believed in the healing power of medicine, but here, in this seemingly perfect little town, she would learn that sickness often comes not from the body, but from the secrets people bury. Dr. Ellie Davis hadn't expected a warm welcome when she arrived in Havenbrook. New doctors rarely got those, especially in places where the town's trust ran as deep as its roots. The children who came to her clinic, pale, listless, with odd and recurring symptoms, brought the first stirrings of suspicion. Parents wept by their bedsides, unable to comprehend why their kids, healthy until recently, were suddenly stricken with mysterious ailments. At first, Ellie chalked it up to an unfortunate but natural outbreak. Then she noticed something unsettling. Each of the affected families, as she pored over patient files late one night, had recently suffered immense financial strain, often leading them to sell their homes to a prominent figure in town, Jackson Carr. Jackson was well known in Havenbrook, both respected and, Ellie suspected, quietly feared. A local real estate magnate, he had been buying up property at an alarming rate, swooping in just as families were forced to make desperate sales to cover medical bills. Ellie's first instinct was that Jackson was somehow orchestrating this crisis. She didn't have proof, just a gnawing intuition that something darker lay beneath his charming smile. Ellie began her investigation, visiting families, talking to them not just as a doctor but as a confidant. Many were willing to open up, especially as they faced mounting bills and the impending threat of losing their homes. They spoke in hushed voices about Jackson's offers, sympathetic, always at just the right moment, offering them a way out when they had none. Ellie knew it was all too convenient. Then there was Angela Hall, the night nurse at the local clinic. Angela had always been eager to help, often staying late to assist Ellie, her warm demeanor making her easy to trust. She had a tiredness about her, a weight she carried that Ellie at first attributed to being a single mother with a young child herself. Angela had mentioned in passing her struggles to make ends meet, the difficulty of balancing her shifts with the demands of her son, who had health issues of his own. One night, Ellie decided to follow her instincts and dig a little deeper. She stayed late, ostensibly to catch up on paperwork, but really to observe. She saw Angela slip into the supply room, not once, but several times, carrying syringes, vials, and supplies that didn't add up when compared to the records. Something twisted inside Ellie as the realization took hold. Angela was stealing supplies, but why? Ellie's breakthrough came when she reviewed the pharmacy logs. Medicines for rare conditions, expensive treatments, had gone missing, but no patients had records for their use. The pieces began to fit. Angela wasn't just taking medicine for her own child. She was siphoning off supplies, falsifying records to hide her theft, and leaving children vulnerable to the tainted or substituted materials she left in place. Angela's motivations became painfully clear when Ellie confronted her late one evening, away from the clinic. Angela's eyes, tired and hollow, filled with tears as she confessed. Her son's mounting medical costs had driven her to desperation. At first, she had just needed a little extra, something to get her through until her next paycheck. Then the debt piled higher, and she realized she could manipulate the situation further, using the children's illnesses to disguise her actions, blaming faulty supplies or bad luck. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," Angela whispered, her voice cracking. I had no choice. They were going to take my son away if I couldn't pay. I didn't know what else to do." Ellie felt an unexpected pang of pity, even as anger coursed through her. Angela's actions were unforgivable, but Ellie understood the fear that had driven her, the instinct to protect at any cost. She promised Angela that she'd do what she could to make sure her son was taken care of, but Angela would have to face justice for what she had done. It wasn't Jackson Carr who had poisoned Havenbrook. He was a predator of opportunity, profiting from the chaos. But the true orchestrator was a mother's desperation, a quiet tragedy that had spiraled into something monstrous. And as Ellie watched Angela being led away by the authorities, she wondered how many more stories like this lay buried beneath the surface of seemingly perfect towns like Havenbrook. Story 5. Title: Beneath the Shadows of Langston Fields. The echoes of the past had a strange way of resurfacing, even when everyone agreed to bury them. Simon Kessler learned that the hard way as he found himself entangled in a dispute that was never about land, but about secrets. Secrets that had tied both the wealthiest and the most downtrodden together, binding them in fear and mutual silence. Simon Kessler was used to being the outsider. As a lawyer who thrived on bringing justice to murky situations, he had dealt with his fair share of complicated cases. But when he arrived in Grayson Hollow, he could feel something in the air, a tension that seemed to go beyond a mere land dispute. The picturesque town had a darkness simmering just beneath its surface. Simon had been called in to mediate a bitter feud between the Langston family, known for their wealth and power, and a group of displaced farmers who claimed the land as their own. The Langstons, headed by Miriam Langston, seemed intent on keeping every inch of their property, while the farmers, led by Paul Reed, were desperate, pleading, and determined to stake their claim. Miriam Langston was an imposing figure, sharp-eyed, dignified, and by Simon's estimation, ruthless. She spoke with a calm authority, dismissing the farmers' claims as nothing but misguided attempts to undermine her family's legacy. It was easy for Simon to believe that Miriam, the powerful matriarch, would resort to any means to hold on to her wealth. She seemed every bit the villain that the farmers had painted her to be. Yet as Simon began to interview the farmers, discrepancies started to surface. Paul Reed spoke passionately about the farmers' rights, but his story lacked the clarity Simon was accustomed to. The more Simon talked to the farmers, the more he felt a subtle shift, a dissonance in their narrative that hinted at something more than just a group of people trying to reclaim their land. The deeper Simon dug, the more elusive the truth became. He began to hear whispers of an incident that had happened years ago, something that people in Grayson Hollow were too frightened to talk about. Late at night, he pored over old newspaper clippings and legal records, trying to understand what had left such a deep scar on the town. He came across vague mentions of a tragic accident on the disputed farmland, but all details had been carefully erased, as if the town had collectively decided to forget. Then one evening, Simon found himself sitting across from an elderly local in the town's lone bar. With enough coaxing and a few too many drinks, the old man spoke of an accident that had claimed the life of a young man, a son of one of Grayson Hollow's elites. It had happened on the farmland now in dispute, and the farmers, led by Paul Reed, had witnessed everything. But rather than seek justice, they had found a way to turn tragedy into leverage. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The farmers weren't the victims they appeared to be. Paul Reed had been using the memory of that tragic night to blackmail the town's elites, keeping them quiet, forcing them to support the farmers' claims, or risk their dark secret coming to light. It was a twisted web of fear, manipulation, and desperation. Miriam Langston wasn't the orchestrator of the farmers' suffering. She was as much a pawn in Paul Reed's game as anyone else. Simon confronted Paul in the farmers' makeshift camp. The man's friendly demeanor melted away as Simon laid out everything he knew: the blackmail, the manipulation, the tragic accident that had been kept hidden for years. Paul's face darkened, and for the first time, Simon saw the cunning and desperation that had driven the farmers' leader to orchestrate this entire scheme. "We did what we had to do," Paul said, his voice low, devoid of regret. "They took from us first. They thought they could pretend it never happened, that we just let our friend's death go unanswered. We used what we had to survive." Simon realized then that there were no true villains here, only people trying to protect themselves, to right wrongs in the only way they knew how, no matter how twisted. The land dispute was just a smokescreen, a way for the farmers to keep their grip on the town's powerful families, to maintain a balance built on a lie. The next morning, Simon stood before the town council, exposing everything he had uncovered. The air in the room was thick with tension, faces pale as the truth came to light. The elites looked at Paul Reed with a mixture of anger and fear, and Paul stared back, defiant even in defeat. Grayson Hollow was a town haunted by its past, and Simon knew that his revelation wouldn't heal the scars overnight. But at least now, the truth was out. As Simon packed up his things and prepared to leave the town, he looked out at the farmland, rolling hills that had been tainted by secrets and suffering. He hoped that, somehow, with the truth revealed, the people of Grayson Hollow could begin to heal. But he also knew that shadows like these don't easily fade, not when they have been part of the town for so long.